You step out onto your back porch on a sweltering July afternoon. The air is thick, almost heavy enough to taste, and through the haze, you hear the metallic, labored thrum of your central air conditioning unit straining against the heat. If you walk around to the side of your house, you can see the digital smart meter, its numbers flickering and climbing relentlessly upward, tallying a debt you will owe to a corporate utility monopoly at the end of the month. For 40 years, we have been told a specific story: that to participate in modern life, you must remain a permanent customer to a centralized grid. We are told that generating your own electricity requires $10,000 in blue silicon solar panels, or a 70-foot steel wind tower in an open field that requires structural engineers, municipal permits, and years of wind assessments. It is an expensive narrative designed to make you look at your own backyard and see nothing but grass and chores. But stop and think about a different scene. A few years ago, I traveled to a quiet half-acre suburban lot just outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to visit a retired electrician named Walter Hostetler. There were no towering steel structures on his property. Instead, mounted along the top rail of his standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence were 4 slender vertical cylinders. Each one was about 5 feet tall, roughly the diameter of an old coffee can, and painted a matte cedar color to match the wood. As the afternoon breeze moved through the yard, they spun almost silently. There was no roaring sound, no strobing shadows cast across the grass, just a soft, steady whir like the sound of dry autumn leaves tumbling down a gravel driveway. Walter hadn't hired a consultant or pulled a municipal permit. He spent less than $100 on hardware store parts and a salvaged alternator from a junkyard Subaru. Yet, within 14 months, that single fence line setup completely wiped out the summer cooling load of his 3-bedroom ranch house. Understand this clearly before we go any further. I am not an academic with scientific credentials, and I am not here to sell you a miracle kit. I am a practitioner who values knowledge tested by time and calluses, and every method I share is one I have touched with my own hands. Because of that, we must establish an honest limit. If you live in a deeply wooded valley where the air stagnates, or a dense urban canyon where the wind never drops below the roofline, a fence turbine will not work for you. This is not a magic solution that allows you to cut your power lines tomorrow morning and throw away your electrical bill entirely. It is a system of supplements. It is designed to capture the low, turbulent, ground-level air that traditional wind turbines cannot use, converting it into a steady, reliable trickle of energy that feeds a small battery bank. It is the art of harvesting what is already passing by your fence posts and turning it into options. Why do we pay for electricity every single month without ever questioning if there is another way? The truth is, this knowledge isn't secret. It was simply pushed to the margins when it became more profitable to make us dependent. The principle of capturing wind on a vertical axis has been utilized for centuries, but its modern practical application was perfected by the Old Order Mennonite and Amish communities. In Holmes County, Ohio, I stood next to a homemade vertical rotor built from scrap sheet metal and old bicycle parts on a farm owned by the Yoder family. That simple machine had been pumping water and charging a 12-volt battery bank since 1978. 47 years of continuous operation with only 2 bearing replacements. When I asked why they chose a vertical design over the tall, propeller-style windmills seen on the plains, the eldest son's answer was simple. The wind down here doesn't come from one direction. It comes from all of them. So we built something that doesn't care. That single observation contains the entire engineering truth of residential wind power. Standard horizontal wind turbines require clean, smooth, unidirectional airflow. Down at fence height, 6 feet off the ground, the wind hits houses, trees, and sheds. It becomes chaotic, swirling and reversing in the span of a single minute. A traditional propeller turbine in that environment spends all its time trying to find the wind, spinning in circles without ever generating a single watt. A vertical turbine, however, operates and is on a different axis. It presents the same surface to the air, no matter where it originates. It doesn't need to adjust. It simply catches the moving air and turns. In 2011, a field study at Caltech, led by Dr. John DeBiase, confirmed that an array of small vertical axis turbines placed close together can produce up to 10 times more power per square meter of land than equivalent horizontal machines. The physics works because vertical turbines scale down perfectly to the human scale. The design Walter used is a specific hybrid that solves the oldest problem in small-scale wind: starting torque, or the force required to get a heavy object moving from a dead stop. By combining a lift-based wing with a simple scoop, a design known as a Savonius-Darius hybrid, he built an assembly that catches even a gentle 4-mile-per-hour breeze, the speed of a slow walk, and forces the turbine to start rotating. His entire bill of materials cost less than $90, using a 10-foot section of 6-inch gray PVC sewer pipe, 4 sheets of aluminum roofing flashing, and 2 standard skateboard bearings. The transition from being a pure consumer to a small-scale producer doesn't require a massive financial leap. It requires understanding how to shape these ordinary materials with your own hands. Let's look directly at how these components fit together on a workbench, and the exact steps to cutting that PVC pipe so you can begin collecting the current this weekend. Clear off a sturdy workbench or a flat patch of concrete in your driveway. To build what Walter built, you do not need an array of specialized machinist tools. You need a jigsaw, a power drill, a tape measure, and a pair of steady hands. Look closely at the materials gathered before you. There is a specific satisfaction in working with elements that were never intended to speak to each other. A plumbing pipe, a piece of roofing, a discarded car part, and forcing them into a harmonious mechanism. We begin with the rotor housing, the physical body that will catch the wind. Take your 10-foot length of 6-inch schedule 40 PVC pipe. It is a dull, slate gray utility pipe, heavy enough to feel substantial, but yielding enough to cut without a struggle. When you run your hand down its length, it feels slightly cool and chalky. Cut this pipe exactly in half to create 2 5-foot sections. Now, take one of those sections. We need to split it lengthwise to create our primary Savonius scoops. Draw a straight line down opposite sides of the cylinder. As your jigsaw moves along the ink line, the blade will produce a high-pitched, rhythmic buzzing, and the air will fill with the sharp, clean, chemical scent of warm plastic dust. The shavings will curl away from the blade like coarse white salt. When you finish the cut, you will have 2 perfect, semi-cylindrical troughs. Stop and think about their shape. They are deep, smooth, and naturally rigid. Do not leave the cut edges raw. Take a piece of 80 grit sandpaper and run it along the edges until the plastic burrs fall away and the rim feels smooth to your thumb. A rough edge creates microturbulence, tiny pockets of swirling air that rob the turbine of its efficiency before the rotor even begins to turn. Repeat this process with the second 5-foot section of pipe. You now have 4 scoops. The common mistake made right here by beginners is haste. They assume any orientation will do. Understand this. The 4 scoops must be mounted around your central shaft in an alternating, overlapping pattern. Picture a cross-section from above. The inner edge of each scoop must overlap the central shaft by about 1 inch, leaving a gap. This gap is vital. When a gust of wind hits the face of one scoop, the air doesn't just push it. It travels through that central gap and hits the backside of the opposite scoop, doubling the torque. If you bolt them flush to the center without that gap, you create a pocket of trapped air that acts as a brake. To hold these scoops together, we use circular end caps. Cut 4 12-inch discs out of 3/4-inch exterior-grade plywood or a sheet of dense polyethylene plastic. Drill a 1/2-inch hole exactly through the dead center of each disc. Slide your 5-foot 1/2-inch threaded steel rod through the center. This rod is the spine of your generator. It is cold, heavy, and gray, with sharp, precision-cut threads that will hold everything in place. Sandwich your PVC scoops between the top and bottom discs, securing them with heavy stainless steel washers and lock nuts. Now look at the bearings. These are standard, sealed, stainless steel skateboard bearings. They are tiny, grease-packed rings no larger than a silver dollar, costing just a few dollars apiece. This is where many people stumble. They tighten the lock nuts on the threaded rod down hard against the bearing faces, thinking tightness equals stability. If you do this, you crush the delicate rubber seals and bind the inner race. The turbine will refuse to spin in anything less than a gale. Instead, use a pair of nuts jammed against each other right above the bearing to lock the height, leaving the bearing itself to spin completely unburdened. Drop the lower bearing into a snug recessed hole drilled into your wooden mounting frame, and place the upper bearing in a matching bracket at the top. Before we mount the unit, we must add the Darius aerodynamic lift wings, the thin aluminum flashing. This is what transforms a simple sluggish paddle wheel into a high-speed hybrid. Cut 4 strips of the shiny silver aluminum roofing flashing, each 5 feet long and 8 inches wide. The metal is thin enough to cut with tin snips, making a crisp, metallic crunching sound with every snip. Be careful. The fresh edges are bright and sharp enough to slice through skin like paper. Shop these strips into a gentle, teardrop airfoil profile by curving them over the outside of your PVC scoops, securing them with small sheet metal screws. When the wind blows, these aluminum wings create a pocket of low pressure on their outer surface, exactly like the wing of an airplane. They pull the turbine forward, allowing it to spin much faster than the speed of the wind itself. Now, let us address the heart of the system, the generator. A salvaged car alternator is built like a tank. It is heavy, smelling faintly of old engine oil and aged varnish from the internal copper windings. However, an automobile alternator is designed to spin at 2,000 rotations per minute under the hood of a speeding car. Your fence turbine will spin at perhaps 300 or 400 rotations per minute in a healthy breeze. If you hook the alternator directly to the turbine shaft, it will produce absolutely nothing. To bridge this gap, we use the principle of mechanical leverage through a simple pulley system. Mount a large 12-inch wooden or plastic pulley wheel to the bottom of your threaded turbine rod. On the alternator shaft, keep the small 2-inch pulley it came with. Connect the two with a short, thick rubber V-belt. When the large turbine wheel completes one full, lazy rotation, it forces the small alternator pulley to spin 6 times faster. Look at the simplicity of it. A mechanical multiplier made from scrap wood and rubber, requiring no electronics to achieve the necessary speed. Your mounting frame is nothing more than a simple vertical box built from 2x4 pressure-treated lumber, smelling strongly of pine resin and chemical preservative. Bolt this frame directly into the structural post of your privacy fence using heavy lag screws. The frame keeps the turbine perfectly vertical. If the tower tilts even 3 degrees, gravity will pull the heavy rotor to one side, creating an uneven load that wears out your lower bearing in a single season. Use a spirit level. Watch the green bubbles settle exactly between the black lines before you tighten the final bolt. At the bottom of the vertical shaft, right where the rod meets the lower bearing, drill a tiny 1/8 inch hole through the bottom plywood disc. This is a small, quiet detail that saves the system from ruin. Moisture is an invisible enemy. Rainwater will inevitably run down the 5-foot lengths of your PVC scoops during a summer storm. Without a drain hole, that water will pool in the bottom cap, submerging your lower bearing and turning the grease into a gritty, rusty paste within months. The hole allows the water to escape instantly, spinning away into the grass as mist. Once the mechanical frame is secure, run 2 lengths of standard 10-gauge insulated copper wire from the alternator terminals along the bottom rail of your fence, tucking it out of sight. Bring it through the wall of your garage or shed. Connect these wires directly to the input terminals of your 30-amp charge controller. The controller is a small, silent plastic box with a digital screen that sits on the wall like a watchman, monitoring the erratic current coming from the wind and smoothing it into a steady, safe flow. From the controller, run 2 more wires to your deep cycle marine battery. Step back and look at what you have assembled. The gray PVC cylinders sit nestled against the wood of your fence, almost completely hidden from the street. They do not look like an industrial power plant. They look like a natural extension of the yard. The assembly is complete, the wires are connected, and the battery is waiting. But do not turn the switch just yet. We must first understand how to calibrate the internal regulator of that alternator, so it begins producing usable voltage the moment the first evening breeze hits the yard, a process that requires a simple 5-cent resistor and a basic understanding of electrical field excitation. Before we watch the rotor spin under the influence of the evening breeze, we must solve the mystery of the alternator that I left you with at the end of our last session. A car alternator is an incredibly durable piece of machinery, but it has a quirk that puzzles most beginners. Unlike a permanent magnet generator, which contains natural magnets that produce electricity the very instant you turn the shaft, a standard automobile alternator contains electromagnets. When it sits cold and unpowered on your workbench, there is no magnetic field inside it. You could spin that shaft with a high-speed power drill until the bearings smoke, and your voltmeter would still read exactly 0. To make it produce power, you must first give it a tiny sip of power. This is a process engineers call field excitation. Inside the alternator, there is a small terminal, usually marked with an L, an I, or an X. To wake the machine up, we run a thin wire from the positive terminal of your 12-volt battery through a simple 5-cent resistor, or even a small 12-volt indicator light bulb, and connect it to that excitation terminal. This small light bulb acts as a gateway. It allows a fraction of an amp to flow from the battery into the internal copper coils of the alternator, turning them into powerful electromagnets. The moment that happens, the alternator is primed. Now, when the turbine spins the pulley, the moving copper wires cut through this newly created magnetic field, and a flood of electricity comes rushing out of the main heavy terminal, traveling down the line to charge your battery bank. It is an elegant loop. You use a teaspoon of energy to wake the giant, and the giant rewards you with a bucketful. To truly master this craft, stop and think about the 2 invisible forces that allow those gray PVC cylinders to turn. They are drag and lift, and they represent the 2 fundamental ways humans have interacted with the movement of the air since the dawn of sail. Think of aerodynamic drag with a simple analogy. Imagine you are riding in a car down a highway at 40 miles per hour. If you open your hand and stick your arm out the window with your palm flat against the oncoming air, the wind will violently slam into your palm and force your arm backward. That is drag. It is raw, brute force. The curved inner scoops of the Savonius part of our turbine work exactly like your open palm. When a gust of air hits them, it has nowhere to go. It catches in the cup of the PVC and pushes it forward. Drag is an incredibly powerful force at low speeds, which is why this turbine has such high starting torque. It can begin turning in a light 4-mile-per-hour breeze that would leave a heavy propeller-style turbine completely paralyzed. But drag has a hard physical limit. An object driven purely by drag can never move faster than the speed of the wind that is pushing it. Now, think about lift. Go back to that moving car window. Instead of keeping your palm flat, turn your hand horizontal so it slices through the air like a knife. Then angle your thumb up just a fraction of an inch. Your entire arm will instantly lift toward the sky. That is aerodynamic lift. It occurs because the air traveling over the curved upper surface of your hand has to move faster than the air passing underneath the flat bottom. This speed difference creates a pocket of low pressure on top, a partial vacuum that literally sucks your hand upward. The thin aluminum flashing wings we wrapped around the outside of our scoops operate purely on this principle. Once the heavy drag forces get the turbine moving, The air begins to flow smoothly over these aluminum airfoils. They create a pocket of low pressure that pulls the turbine forward, allowing the outer edges of the rotor to spin 2, 3, or even 4 times faster than the wind itself. By combining both forces into a single hybrid, you get the best of both worlds: the brute force starting power of drag at low speeds, and the high-speed efficiency of lift once the machine gets moving. Understand this clearly, though. We must establish an honest limit. I will not stand here and paint a romantic picture of complete energy independence without showing you where the boundaries of this method lie. A tool misunderstood is a tool that will eventually disappoint you. First, consider the boundary of geography. If your property sits in a deep geographic depression, a low valley shielded by high ridges, or a suburban lot tightly surrounded by mature, 70-foot oak trees and 2-story brick homes, this turbine will not perform. It can harvest chaotic wind, but it cannot harvest dead air. If a handheld anemometer shows your fence line rarely sees an average wind speed above 5 miles per hour, this project will become nothing more than a rotating lawn ornament. Second, look at the limit of scale. A $90 fence turbine produces what I call survival power, not luxury power. A single 5-foot unit in an average 8-mile-per-hour breeze will produce roughly 150 watt-hours of electricity over the course of a day. If you build an array of 4 units, you are looking at perhaps 600 watt-hours daily. Understand what that means in practical terms. It is enough energy to run a high-efficiency refrigerator for a few hours, keep your home internet router and smartphones powered indefinitely, and light up every LED bulb in your house at night. It will not run an electric clothes dryer. It will not run a water heater, an electric oven, or a central air conditioning system. Those appliances require thousands of watts of continuous heat energy. If you attempt to run them off a small fence line system, you are trying to empty an ocean with a thimble. Third, look at the limitations of your materials. Schedule 40 PVC is a magnificent, cheap utility material, but it has a vulnerability: ultraviolet light from the sun. If you leave that slate gray pipe raw and exposed to the elements, the sun's rays will slowly break down the chemical bonds of the plastic over 5 or 6 years, making it brittle until a sudden winter gust cracks a scoop right down the middle. You must protect it by applying a thorough coat of UV-resistant exterior latex paint. Furthermore, using a car alternator introduces a slight electrical tax. Because the field excitation circuit requires continuous current to keep the internal electromagnets alive, the alternator consumes about 2 watts of electricity just to stay awake. If the wind dies down completely for 3 straight days and the turbine sits perfectly still, that tiny 5-cent resistor will continue to draw power from your battery to excite the alternator, slowly draining your reservoir into nothingness. To prevent this, you must install a simple voltage-sensitive relay or a manual toggle switch to cut the excitation circuit when the air turns completely calm. Now that you understand the forces at play and the strict boundaries of the machine, we are ready to step back to the workbench and address the final puzzle: how to rewire the internal stator of that junked Subaru alternator to triple its power output at ultra-low speeds. To resolve the puzzle of the alternator speed requirement, we must look at a manual adjustment that requires patience rather than money. To make a car alternator produce 12 volts at 300 rotations per minute instead of 2,000, you must open its metal casing by removing the 3 long bolts holding the housing together. Inside, you will find the stator, a heavy iron ring wrapped in 3 distinct sets of thick copper wire coils. If you smell it, it carries the sharp, distinct scent of old electrical varnish and dried machine grease. The factory wire inside is thick because a car demands 80 or 100 amps of current at high speeds. For our fence line system, we do not need raw amperage. We need voltage at low speeds. Take a pair of wire cutters and carefully snip the factory coils, pulling the copper away until the iron teeth of the stator are completely bare. Now, take a spool of much thinner, 24-gauge enamel-insulated magnet wire. You will rewind these iron teeth by hand, counting exactly 3 times the number of loops the factory put in each slot. It is a slow, quiet task that will leave your fingertips stained with copper dust and your forearms weary. But as the thin wire clicks against the iron core, you are physically changing the internal architecture of the machine. By tripling the number of copper turns, you ensure that even a slow, gentle rotation of the turbine blades forces the internal magnetic field to cut the wire often enough to push 12 volts into your battery bank. You have bypassed the need for high speeds through simple, focused handwork. When you do this, you are not inventing a new science. You are merely stepping back into a stream of knowledge that ran deep through this country before the grid became a monopoly. The physical principles of our hybrid turbine were established over a century ago by 2 distinct minds working on opposite sides of the world. In 1922, a Finnish engineer named Sigurd Savonius noticed how the wind caught the sails of ships and designed the deep, drag-based vertical scoop that bears his name. 9 years later, in 1931, a French aeronautical engineer named Georges Darius patented the elegant, curved lift-based airfoil wing. For decades, these 2 ideas remained separate, treated by large-scale industry as minor academic curiosities. Large corporations were focused entirely on building massive horizontal propellers that resembled traditional Dutch windmills, because those massive structures could be centralized in large, distant fields where a utility company could control the access and send you a monthly bill for the transmission. The proof that a different path existed was documented by our own institutions, only to be left on warehouse shelves. If you look into the archives of the federal government, you will find a research paper published in March of 1981 by Sandia National Laboratories, catalogued under the designation Sandy 0984. The title is plain: Darius Rotor Performance at Low Wind Speeds. Inside its pages, printed in the stark, monochromatic typewriter font of the era, are the complete testing data for small-scale vertical axis machines. The engineers at Sandia demonstrated that when these rotors are scaled down and operated in the lower turbulent layers of the atmosphere, their efficiency does not collapse, rather. Their ability to harvest omnidirectional wind makes them remarkably steady producers of household energy. Yet, as the energy crises of the 1970s faded from public memory, that study was quietly archived, and the funding for small-scale urban wind research was redirected toward utility-scale installations. An even more striking confirmation sits further back in history. In 1935, during the height of the Great Depression, the United States Department of Agriculture published Farmer's Bulletin No. 1733, titled Wind Electric Generators for Farm Use. If you were to find an original copy in an estate sale today, you would see a simple brown paper pamphlet with yellowed edges, smelling of old wood pulp and basement storage. That bulletin did not contain complex formulas or theoretical calculations. It was a practical blueprint distributed free to thousands of isolated homesteaders across the Great Plains. It showed a farmer how to take an old Dodge or Ford generator from a junkyard, carve a wooden rotor from a scrap piece of spruce lumber, and wire it to a used tractor battery to light their kitchen and power a basic radio. It was a document that treated self-sufficiency as a normal, dignified standard of American rural life. But by 1946, as the Rural Electrification Administration completed the process of hanging copper wire from pole to pole across the country, that bulletin was quietly removed from the active printing list. The independent producer was systematically transformed into a dependent consumer, and the collective memory of how to harvest the air with simple tools was erased within 2 generations. Why did we allow this tradition to slide into obscurity? The answer is simple. A household that relies entirely on a wire coming from the street is a household that must pay whatever price is demanded. A household that looks at its own property line and sees a source of current is a household that has options. The Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities never surrendered these options because they recognized that true independence is not built on complex, fragile technologies that require a team of specialists to maintain. It is built on mechanisms that can be repaired on a kitchen table using a screwdriver and a flashlight. Stop and think about the fence that encloses your own yard. It has stood there for years, weathering the rain and the sun, acting as nothing more than a barrier to keep things in or out. This weekend, before the season turns and the cold air settles into the ground, I invite you to walk out to that boundary line. Do not go out there with a smartphone or a notebook. Just walk out to the furthest corner of your lot and stand there for 1 full minute in complete silence. Feel the movement of the air against the skin on the back of your hand. That movement is not empty space. It is a river of kinetic energy that has been flowing past your home every single day you have lived there. Look down the length of that fence and begin to count the vertical posts. Each one of those pressure-treated 4x4s is a foundation that is already anchored in the earth, already squared and already paid for. They are not just supports for wooden slats. They are the ready-made towers for a quiet home-scale power station. To transition from a customer who pays a monthly tribute to a producer who harvests their own valley requires no grand political statement and no massive financial risk. It requires less than $100 in ordinary materials, a couple of afternoons of measured work on your bench, and the simple decision to remember what the world spent 40 years trying to make you forget. The tools are common, the physics is durable, and the air belongs to no one but you. Go out to your fence, count the posts, and begin the work.